Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's MDICx webinar. My name is Liliana Rincon-Gonzalez. I'm the Program Director for Clinical Sciences and for the EFS initiative here at MDIC. It is my pleasure to host this webinar on EFS site best practices, implementation strategies from the sponsor perspective. This is our second webinar. Our first webinar was on EFS best practices from the site perspective. And this time around, we wanted to hear from the sponsor perspective. So today, I have invited a representative from a small company and a representative from a large company to share with us their experience with implementing early feasibility studies. In addition, we have invited an FDA representative to provide an overview and update of Cdrh EFS program. Okay, let's go over the agenda. First, we'll have each of my panelists introduce themselves. Then we will listen to each of the presentations. And finally, we will open the webinar for questions. Please use the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen to type your questions. I will read each of the questions so the panelists can answer them. Because right now, everyone is muted, so please let me know if you would like to speak or just type your question. Finally, I just want to let everyone know that the recording and the slides will be available on our website, and the people who register for the webinar will get an email with the link in the next week or so. And we will start with Maureen from the FDA.
Thank you, Liliana. Hi, everyone. I'm Maureen Dreher. I work at Cdrh, and I actually work in the policy and operations team within our Division of Clinical Science and Quality at Cdrh's Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis. Cdrh recently underwent a reorganization, so some of these divisions and acronyms for our pre-market structure might look a little bit less familiar to some of you than past organizational structures. But this team has responsibility for overseeing the Investigational Device Exemptions Program, as well as several other initiatives that FDA has, including the Early Feasibility Study Program and the Breakthrough Devices Program. At a high level, what we do is work with Cdrh pre-market review teams to interpret FDA statutes, regulations, and policies pertaining to IDEs, clinical evidence generation, as well as good clinical practice and human subjects protections. I've started out my career here at Cdrh as a biomedical engineer, and I'm currently acting as the Assistant Director for this Policy and Operations team. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Then we have Bertha.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bertha Torres. I'm a Senior Trial Manager at Edwards Lifesciences in the TMTT Business Unit, which is the Transcatheter, Mitral, and Tricuspid Therapies unit. And my research journey began over 20 years ago at a clinical research site. I transitioned into a CRO and then, ultimately landed with a sponsor where I've been here for the past 13 years. I've had the pleasure of starting up over 5 early feasibility studies here, and I look forward to sharing our experience with you guys.
Thank you, Bertha. And finally, Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Cain. First of all, thank you for signing on to the MDIC webinar. I am the Vice President of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at Conformal Medical. Conformal Medical is a small startup. We have about 9 employees. Prior to joining Conformal, I was the VP of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs for Careenous Vascular Robotics, recently acquired by Siemens. I'm a member of ACRP and RAPS, and I have certification in both of those organizations. In my 20+ years in clinical research, I've conducted 4 first-in-human trials, all outside the US. And this is my first EFS, and I'm here to share my experience with that process. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And we'll start with Maureen. Let me give you access to the screen. Okay, you should be able to control the screen now.
Okay. Yeah, there we go. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to be giving you Cdrh's perspective and a summary on our early feasibility studies program, starting with a more historical perspective and then giving a little bit of a look ahead. So several years ago, around the 2014 timeframe, Cdrh put out a mission and vision statement that patients in the U.S. would have access to high-quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And in order to support this vision statement, Cdrh has launched a number of initiatives throughout the past several years. The Early Feasibility Study program was one of the first initiatives that really aligned with this vision and helped to promote it. And one of the reasons why I really enjoy working in Early Feasibility Study programs so much is because it really speaks to the fact that overall, at the end of the day, patients are really at the heart of what we do here. Additionally, Cdrh has a large amount of support for device innovation, and the EFS program is, one of the early mechanisms we had to do that. If we think about a typical and very simplified depiction of the development of a device, would begin with preclinical testing, moving into clinical studies to support a marketing application, and then the device advancing to commercialization and being further used in the post-market. One of the pieces that's key to facilitating this is this loop in between gaining initial clinical information and feeding that back into early development of the device. As I mentioned, we have several programs to support device innovation and help it proceed through this type of development pathway. And many of these initiatives are designed to intersect with the pathway at different points. Certainly the Early Feasibility Study program, which I'll be highlighting today, intersects with this pathway at more of the earlier stages. But things like real-world evidence, which are also coming up at Cdrh, are designed to interface with this type of pathway using data from the post-market to try to feed it back into device development and further clinical uses for devices. So if we put ourselves back about 10 or 15 years ago, the initial clinical testing for novel devices had moved primarily to non-US sites, and this was really the norm. There was certainly concern that device innovation itself would follow, and it may improve OUS more quickly. Devices were being developed for non-US markets, and there was a growing concern regarding the time lag and availability of beneficial medical devices for US patients. Certainly many clinical study ecosystem factors were contributing to these trends, but FDA's data requirements for initiating clinical studies in the US were one of those factors. And it was this recognition and all of these motivating factors that really urged FDA and Cdrh to launch the Early Feasibility Study program. So this program was really formalized with a final guidance in 2013. We had a pilot for the program before that, kind of leading up to this, but it formally launched in 2013, and that's almost 6 years ago now, so the program has had quite a few successes over those first years. The guidance document describes how early feasibility studies are designed to help advance a device from the non-clinical testing phase, where developers may have exhausted all of their abilities to get non-clinical information on the device, and move into clinical studies, and then use some of that clinical information to further device development. So one thing to recognize is that early feasibility studies are done under investigational device exemptions, or IDEs, which is the mechanism for studying a unapproved significant risk clinical device in the US. And with an EFS IDE, the application package would have all of the same required elements and types of features that an IDE application might have for a larger clinical study, except that with an EFS, there's greater level of uncertainty about how the device will perform, usually because the device is early in development and has a new intended use. Early feasibility studies are characterized by being conducted on a small number of subjects, and overall they're designed to provide an initial indication of safety or effectiveness and more proof of concept information, so that the sponsor can obtain some initial insights on the device safety and performance or more insights into the patient population and use that to design a future study. Our guidance document does walk through some key policies for this program, and the first is doing the right testing at the right time. We do recognize that comprehensive testing during those early phases of device development can add significant costs without return, but informative non-clinical testing should be completed prior to initiating the clinical investigation. Within EFS, we also recognize that there's enhanced opportunities to leverage data from earlier versions of the device with appropriate justification, and that unknowns and risks can be addressed not only through non-clinical testing, but really through the use of clinical mitigations as well, and appropriate ones that will provide patients with extra protection. One of my favorite examples in this is the use of more frequent or detailed reporting. The guidance document also provides sponsors with some tools to help them communicate available data to Cdrh and better justify why an early feasibility study is the most appropriate next step for that device development. This is done through what we call a device evaluation strategy, and that allows sponsors to kind of line up their non-clinical testing that's available along with clinical mitigations and show how both of those things can work together to address risks and demonstrate that various device attributes can function. Certainly, we see many benefits for this program, not only on the FDA sponsor and device developers and innovators side, but also with respect to clinicians and patients as well. The early feasibility study program is really designed to establish a collaboration between FDA and the device developers. And some of the benefits of that include FDA getting familiarity with the technology up front, and the sponsors and innovators being able to get early, perhaps earlier, access to an understanding of what the regulatory considerations are, and then building those into their development pathway. The program, because it's designed to facilitate early human clinical research in the United States, gives some new opportunities to clinicians for addressing unmet clinical needs and allows them to gain some early experience with innovative technologies. And of course, the program really encourages the development of high-quality medical products for patients. So overall, initiating the EFS is a collaborative effort that can begin before the IDE application is submitted through sponsors really making effective use of our pre-submission process. This slide summarizes the program historically through the last 5 years or so. There's been strong growth in sponsors utilizing the program, with more than a doubling of EFS IDEs submitted over the past 6 years. And more than 75% of these get to an approval decision within 2 cycles. Over 200 early feasibility studies have been approved to treat or diagnose more than 2,500 patients. And that's a real impact that we see in clinical research for the United States. We're not quite through our fiscal year 2019 yet, but it is on pace to yield similar submission numbers to fiscal years 15 to 17. One of the things that I really enjoy also about early feasibility studies is that it's possible to do early feasibility studies in a wide range of clinical specialties. We certainly see a high use of the program in cardiovascular and neurological devices, but we have experience with the program in a much broader clinical specialty set, and all of those areas can benefit from doing early feasibility studies. Recently, we've been thinking a little bit more about how to facilitate the next steps after an EFS and what can be leveraged and learned from these studies. Certainly, with an EFS, one of the emphases are to improve the device and to design more efficient, larger studies, such as that pivotal study. And we've been thinking about many ways to facilitate a transition to a pivotal study. One of the things to keep in mind here is certainly to start discussions with FDA early, even while that EFS is ongoing. These can include discussions on the pivotal study design as you're still collecting data on the EFS patients. And what we can do is work with sponsors through IDE supplements to expand that EFS patients being treated while that pivotal study is being developed in order to serve as kind of a bridge to advancing to a larger standalone study. Also, we certainly recommend that sponsors address any necessary non-clinical testings to support a pivotal study in parallel with their EFS progression. And that can be done through a couple of different mechanisms we have to facilitate discussions with the FDA review team. So in summary, this program is designed to facilitate early clinical study of devices in the U.S. And for sponsors who are interested, we do highly recommend utilizing our pre-sub process to establish that early and ongoing collaboration in order to advance the study. The device evaluation strategy-based approach is a key one for a successful IDE submission because it enables appropriate non-clinical testing and use of clinical mitigations as kind of side-by-side and presenting that to a tool for communicating that in a clear manner to FDA. Overall, the program supports learning from the study to improve the device design in an efficient pivotal study, and we really value its utilization by a diverse set of clinical specialties. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the next presenter.
Okay, hello everyone. Like I mentioned earlier, my name is Bertha Torres. I'm a Senior Trial Manager at Edwards Lifesciences, and I will be going over, providing an overview of best practices in pursuit of the quickest, startup process possible for early feasibility studies. Sorry, having a little bit of lag here on the slides. Okay, so there are several benefits to early feasibility studies. Obviously to the patient, there's, access to novel, potentially life-saving technology, early exposure to the novel technology for the FDA as well. For our sites, we have, expert key opinion leaders that stay involved in innovation. And for sponsors, that, gives us earlier access to high-quality EFS data and outcomes. So we're all in pursuit of this 60-60-60 model, and I believe this is last year's slide, and there's new data from the annual forum that just occurred. However, the key takeaway here is, keeping track of timelines from IDE approval all the way through first patient in. This is very beneficial, information, and I'd like to thank MDIC and Liliana for gathering all of this info for everyone. So I'll be going over each of these steps and some of our strategies in trying to obtain quicker timelines on this. So for 60-day IDE approval, as Maureen mentioned, discussing your plans with the FDA is very beneficial earlier to go over requirements in your plan, and that could save a lot of time in gaining alignment and avoiding unnecessary tasks. Another one of the key benefits here is also to limit your urge to collect data without a known purpose. Some of those items could be, it's difficult to balance. However, if not managed properly, it can result in excessive data collection, which will, result in a lot of site effort and hours, monitoring time, and, most importantly, a huge impact on your budget. And ultimately, it's not useful information. So, you want to have a well-defined patient population, and you want to ensure that you're only collecting the necessary data. and that you limit your number of non-standard of care assessments, and that you really take a look and leverage protocols that have been previously approved by the FDA. And of course, having that early discussion with the FDA will also ensure that you are only coming to the table with what's absolutely necessary and avoiding a lot of those timeline constraints or lags by including a lot of information that won't be useful in the end anyways. For IRB approval, 60-day IRB approval, it's very important to leverage central IRBs where possible. What we've realized is that some of our central IRBs will review concurrently with the FDA submission, and that has been very helpful, and that we will receive conditional approval, and then upon receiving FDA approval, they'll release a full approval. But that helps us also submit to CMS earlier by having an IRB approval. And in addition to that, we have that discussion, early discussion with our central IRB as well as to what items will be necessary, which sites will be able to leverage the central IRB. One of the downsides that we've seen, though, with a central IRB is that a lot of institutions are now requiring their own internal approval prior to allowing their institution to use a central IRB. And so sometimes that doesn't, in the past it was a quicker timeline to use a central IRB, and now with the institutional requirements, we're seeing that you essentially have two layers of an approval process where the institutions are having to submit to their local IRB so that they can approve the site going and submitting to a central IRB. And so our timelines have been pushed out a little bit there, but to us, it's still beneficial to use the central IRB to receive that approval and be able to submit to CMS earlier. So it could be a bit more expensive, but that the speed that we gain in being able to expedite the CMS submission is still a great benefit. Another item that we have been frequently using is to really have the discussion with our sites regarding any informed consent site-specific requirements, ensure that our template, covers all necessary items and that we're prepared with site-specific requirements such as risk stratification, percentages. A lot of sites have their own requirements as to how they want that data organized. And so what we've done is just have drafts of several different methods so that we are prepared and we could speed that up as well when it's requested by the IRB. We've been keeping a list of all of our sites that we go to with all of those site-specific requirements so that we're prepared in advance. And then in addition, we have been, having discussions with our investigators and doing some training and requesting that they be present during the IRB meetings, and that seems to be very helpful as well. So, and it avoids having a back and forth, questions and response added to your timeline. To just have the investigators present during that IRB meeting for the local IRBs, and they're able to answer any questions that they may have. And a lot of times that, really avoids, again, adding to the approval timeline. So for 60-day contract approval, we obviously want to leverage a master clinical trial agreement. It could be the MDIC clinical trial agreement or a sponsored developed version. It definitely, cuts down the time. We all know that starting from scratch with a master clinical trial agreement could take a very long time and have a huge impact to your timelines. And so one of the strategies that we use here at Edwards is to provide a line item budget worksheet in Excel that is aligned with the schedule assessments in the protocol. And so we provide these to our sites as soon as we provide regulatory documents and really go through and have the site identify which exams are standard of care. And it really seems to speed up the negotiation time and the review time. And it's been proven to be a very useful tool. And that was all that I had. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have my slides coming up.
Hi, Chris. Are you having trouble controlling the screen?
Oh, yeah, it's still on.
Yeah, I don't know why it's doing that.
Still on Edwards. Oh, there it goes. Okay. I have to do the next thing too. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bertha. I will reflect on my experience with the EFS program and identify some best practices from the small company perspective. There we go. Okay. At the beginning of the EFS journey, there are many things to consider when planning for an EFS. That being said, one consideration, burn rate, is at front of mind for small sponsors and influences many of the decisions. The EFS journey consists of 3 legs: preparation for IDE submission to first patient in, and conducting the trial. Making the decision to participate in an EFS and embarking on the first leg was a bit of a journey into the unknown. The program was relatively new, and conducting first-in-human OUS was predictable, or at least it used to be. To make that first leg less daunting, I suggest the following. Engage with FDA early and often. As many of these devices are novel, and in some cases the companies may be new to FDA, bring your technology to the first in-person pre-submission meeting so FDA can become familiar with the technology up front. You want to have frequent communication, and you want to keep your reviewer informed. In building the infrastructure during this early phase of product life cycle, there are many unknowns potentially requiring a pivot due to device iterations, safety evaluations, redefining patient population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With that in mind, I like to have a mix of insourcing and outsourcing to support the hills and valleys ahead. The critical success factor in building the team is experience. Ensure the collective team, that being CRO and vendors, if you choose to use a CRO, are knowledgeable in the therapeutic area and understand the nuances of first-in-human trials. We don't know what we don't know, so the monitors and other trial staff should be able to look beyond the bow. As with FDA, reach out to CMS early in your budgeting planning. Find a contact within CMS who can help you navigate the submission process and help uncover any potential surprises. You may, for instance, you may discover your device is on an NCD path versus the IDE path, and you may end up not getting coverage based on that NCD, that National Coverage Determination. FDA category A or B is inconsequential if CMS denies you coverage. So find that information out early. Historically, the IDE to the first patient in was a long, winding road. But as a result of the EFS program, this leg has become more predictable. And with sites, sponsors, and regulators working together to achieve the 60-60-60 goal, it's become faster. For instance, IDE approval can typically be gained within 60 days. An important aspect of this leg is site selection. When evaluating sites, I suggest finding sites who have EFF, the initial sites that have, make sure they have EFS experience. Make sure they have the patients and patients. Patients, the majority of these trials are first in humans, so a lot of learning is going on, resulting in many protocol amendments, process changes, etc. You also want to make sure that you have collaborative engaged investigators, because the device you're working on, the procedure may evolve over the course of the trial. You'll most likely have some device iterations, and you'll also want to be in frequent communication with these investigators as you move through this process. You want to ensure that the site will assign the most experienced coordinators to your EFS project. And of course, you want quick IRB approval and quick contracting and budgeting approval. Budgeting contracts remains the bottleneck of site activation. Using a master clinical trial agreement, in our case, we're using the MDIC MCTA, can speed up the process, but make sure you inform the sites that you're using it. And also, one thing I found beneficial is MDIC held a roundtable about a year or so ago where many of the sites had representatives, and they discussed the master clinical trial agreement. Let the sites know that you're using the agreement, and also try to find that representative, that attorney who participated in that roundtable, because they'll understand the background in that MCTA. And even when you're using an MCTA, the typical issues of patient injury and indemnification continue to be the sticklers. Instead of going back and forth via email, I suggest you get the lawyers on the phone and talk it through. And for budgeting, have your CMS and your FDA reimbursement identified before you create the template, your budget template. And inform the sites of reimbursement status, whether you have, CMS, Medicare reimbursement, or category A and or B, let them know that. If known, provide a DRG. Also establish a consistent standard, for instance, Medicare plus 20 when you're creating the template. And get on the phone, just as you would with a contract, get on the phone and talk through the budget. Identify the things that are protocol required, and also have a good idea on what the procedural costs are, so you can negotiate that. So in this journey, my key learnings were engage FDA and CMS early. Frequent communication with the sites, the regulators, and the vendors. And use a master clinical trial agreement. In your selection of your first few sites, select those sites who have EFS experience. And then also you'll need to have experienced staff, CRA and clinical research coordinators participating in your project. And also, did I mention frequent communication? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And we do have a few questions. And just to remind everyone, please use the Q&A box or the chat box. The first question I have is, was the 60-60-60 slide an MDIC slide or something that Edwards is trying to do? And I just want to clarify that there is an MDIC slide, and that's a program that we have under our pilot where we want sites and sponsors to try to achieve the 60-60-60, where in the first 60 days, we want them to get IRB approval and contract approval, and then on the next 60 days to get to first subject enrollment. The other question we have is, this is for Maureen, how does Cdrh know how many early feasibility studies are conducted in the US and out of the US?
Right, so that's a great question. The FDA does not track any early feasibility studies, or really other clinical studies in a coordinated manner that are only conducted OUS. It's not something that we typically look at, and it's not actually something that we even have visibility to necessarily. But our local IT systems at the FDA do allow us to track any early feasibility studies that are done under an IDE in the United States, because we receive, review, and review the IDE application itself for the EFS IDE. So it's something that we can track for US.
Thank you. And I think there's another question for you. It says, please educate us about non-significant risk devices that do not need an IDE.
Sure. So IDE regulations are described in FDA regulations. Is called Code of Federal Regulations Part 812. And within those set of regulations, there's a definition for non-significant risk studies and significant risk devices, significant risk devices are those which, in kind of a colloquial summary way of saying it, are those which pose a serious risk to the health, safety, or welfare of human subjects. And those significant risk studies do require an IDE. Non-significant risk studies are those which don't pose that serious risk to subjects. And we do have a guidance document describing non-significant risk versus significant risk studies and how to make that determination. With a non-significant risk study, it doesn't require the IDE application, but there are some other requirements under Part 812 which sponsors still need to meet. And that's also outlined in the regulations and in that guidance document. When we talk about early feasibility studies here, specifically, we're really only talking about those which are for significant risk devices and require that IDE application. There may be other investigations going on in the United States which are non-significant risk and being conducted on a small number of subjects.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen. There's a question about IRBs, and maybe it's related to what Bertha said. The question is approval by central IRB required? If not, what value is added by central IRB review in addition to local IRB review?
Yes, so central IRB approval is not required, but it is required for an IRB approval is required for CMS submission. And so what we have found is what I mentioned, during the slide presentation is that we can submit to WIRB, which is a central IRB, concurrently with our FDA submission. And so that really speeds up the timeline for us in that as soon as we receive FDA approval, the conditional approval turns into a full approval. And we've seen that be as quick as, 2 to 4 days, which, with any other IRB, we usually have to wait until we have that FDA approval to submit. So for us, it definitely cuts down the timeline. But it is not required.
Thank you, Bertha. And I also wanted to say that based on the metrics that MDIC collected this summer, which is the updated version of what you showed in your slide about the IRB approval, contract approval times, and first subject enrollment, what I noticed was that the sites that are using both central IRB and local IRB are taking the longest, which makes sense, and it agrees with what your experience is. The fastest sites are using central IRB.
Yes, and it definitely, I think, is a result of these new, and they're new to me, I hadn't experienced so much in the past, but most institutions now are implementing that local IRB approval prior to utilizing a central IRB.
Yeah.
And that, like I said, it layers, you're essentially going through 2 rounds of IRB approval, so it definitely is taking longer.
Yeah, but I should also clarify that the sites that are just using local IRB, they're not doing too bad either. Their times are closer to central IRB. The ones that are too long is when you have the 2 layers.
Correct.
let me ask you another question from the audience. How do you deal with sites that commit to participation and don't enroll a single patient in EFS? It is expensive for small companies to experience this. Sites don't accept contract language that require them to enroll a patient to receive payment. And maybe Chris, do you have any experience being a small sponsor with this?
So in the EFS, I have not. I've had sites that didn't make it through the startup process, mainly for contractual reasons and budgets, but not a site that's made it all the way through and not had any enrollments. And I think that goes to, using those initial sites in your selection who have EFS experience. And for, many reasons. One, they understand the risks associated with this first-in-human work, and they also are experienced in the consenting process. They know how to talk to patients about these types of studies. Because when you're sitting, the patient's sitting on the other side of the table, and they ask you how many, patients have received this treatment, and your answer is none. That's a tough conversation to have. So, these experienced sites have had that conversation many times and are used to, navigating through that process and making the patients, getting them to feel comfortable with what's going on and having them make an informed decision.
Right. And I will also say that part of our MDIC network of sites, we have a network of 31 sites, and the idea is that those sites are experienced with early feasibility studies. Not all are as of right now, but at least everyone that is part of the network are committed and trying to meet the 60-60-60 or want to learn about the best practices that we're sharing with everyone, just like this webinar. And we'll be posting a list of those sites on the website soon. But you can always contact me if you want to know the name of those sites. I have another question. Is FDA working with CMS regarding EFS also? Also curious from sponsor perspective, in the last example, what discussions FDA is having with CMS, or if this is within their imperatives, or what to expect?
I can start to take that. This is Maureen. It would be helpful to also hear any other perspectives from Bertha and Chris regarding their experiences with respect to coverage of EFS. It's a very good question because FDA is only one piece of the puzzle in getting EFS studies initiated in the U.S. And if you get an IDE approved for an EFS, you won't learn anything until that study is actually initiated. And that requires, several other pieces of the puzzle outside of FDA. So we have some conversations with CMS about a variety of topics. And EFS does come up from time to time. There are, obviously different requirements that CMS has for covering a study, and what they consider when they're making a coverage determination is different from what FDA considers when reviewing and potentially approving an IDE. So our conversations with CMS are usually presented around trying to understand what regulatory and legal constraints and considerations go into making each of those respective decisions. Because we do realize that that is a significant part of the process for initiating the study once we approve the IDE.
Thank you, Maureen. And I don't know if Chris or Bertha have anything to add.
Well, I mentioned it a little bit about, CMS and interacting with them early, to uncover any potential surprises. And, one surprise that I ran into was this national coverage determination that some devices have specific clinical trial requirements for reimbursement of Medicare. And those are helpful to identify those early in the process. And I think it's irrespective of what FDA has, provided in the approval letter. So I think that's something to make sure you're aware of when you're going down this path.
And I would just echo what Chris said and what we've been mentioning throughout the session, and that is just to stay in close communication. Close communication with CMS as well as with FDA is just really helpful. Kind of knowing what to anticipate up front really just helps speed things up.
Yeah, and we actually have a comment about experience with CMS. It says, our company has successfully obtained Category B for a Class 3 active implantable after 15 patients. We are able to leverage existing technology as rationale for addressing risk. We could not get Category B in first-in-human. By definition, we were a first-in-human experimental device. Excellent interaction with CMS and thrilled to have such a positive outcome. So that's good to hear that some people are having positive outcomes with that. Someone is wanting to speak. Let me figure out how to do that. I think whoever raised their hand, can you do that again? Okay, I'll just keep reading for now. I think this is just a clarification. Did you say WERB will review without any FDA approval or review if you have conditional approval? And I think Bertha.
So, yes, so you can submit to WERB without FDA approval. What they will do is that they will review all of your documents, and if everything goes well, they will issue conditional approval. And then upon FDA approval, when you submit that letter, then they will turn it into a full approval.
Oh, that's good to know. I didn't know that.
Yes, it helps quite a bit with the timelines as well.
Okay. Someone is asking, what quality systems guidance does MDIC provide, if any? Well, this goes to our pilot program, and I guess what we're doing to help sites and sponsor is develop our tools and templates. So we develop a template for contract. So that's the Master Clinical Trial Agreement that Chris mentioned. And we also have an informed consent template that some sites and sponsors are using. And right now, what we're doing is getting metrics from sponsors so we can try to measure if those templates are useful for sites and sponsors. So that's where we are right now in that process. And I guess I'll take this opportunity to ask Chris and Bertha if they have any feedback on the MDIC 60/60 goal and program.
I don't have anything to add to it. I'm sorry. I don't have experience with it yet.
So I do use the MDIC Master Clinical Trial Agreement. Being a small sponsor, we have one study, so we don't have numerous studies going on with the same site where we could have one internally with the site we're working with. So we find that beneficial. There's still the same issues of patient injury and our subject injury and indemnification that come up. So, but the overall process, we've had one site that was from the time documents were delivered, study documents were delivered to IRB approval was less than 6 weeks, and included the first patient in. So, using this process, the process you mentioned, and then also the documents that are available from MDIC, it has been helpful.
Well, thank you. And I think that person clarified that the mean quality system as it relates to EFS and requirements from FDA. And I just want to mention that both templates were made by a group of people who are very familiar with those requirements. And also we always have an FDA representative in our meetings and working groups. So they all follow the guidelines, if that's what they meant. But I also wanted to add that, and this is something that Bertha mentioned, that they keep a list of site-specific language for informed consent. And that is something that we're trying to do more with our templates here in MDIC. With the contracting template, we do have that. We have a list of language and specific language from sites that they would not negotiate beyond that. So we have a list of that. And we're thinking about doing the same thing for our informed consent template. And ideally, we will share that with everyone. So I think that will be very useful for both sites and sponsors to know upfront what are the things that sites and sponsors can and cannot do.
I would totally echo that, Liliana, that just anticipating the specific site requirements and being ready ahead of time with that, it really helps out a lot. So that would be great.
Good. There's another question here. Does either FDA or MDIC have any data on the number of early feasibility studies of innovative devices that are conducted under an abbreviated IDE versus an IDE approved by FDA? Can someone confirm that FDA's EFS program and MDIC's EFS project do not include early feasibility studies conducted under an abbreviated IDE, so that statistics and goals are only for studies requiring IDE approval by FDA?
I can start with that. I can confirm that all the numbers I've presented today are based on studies that require the full requirements of IDE regulations and are done under an IDE. We do not keep track of any non-significant risk studies done under abbreviated requirements of 812 in a formal manner.
Yeah, and I think all the data that I have collected from sponsors is for all IDE approvals. There's another question here. Due to the high risk nature of EFS devices, do all of your studies include an independent DSMB?
No, that is, we do see that in some EFS studies, but not all of them will use a independent DSMB.
Okay, another question here. Some local IRBs will also work with industry to submit parallel IRB submission to FDA and give conditional approval until FDA approval comes through. This also helps with CMS, in addition to central IRB.
Oh, that's great to know. We haven't had any of our local IRBs offer that up, but it's good information to have. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, that's good to know. Thank you for sharing too. And I think there's no more questions from the audience, but I do have a few questions for you guys. And I guess for both the sponsors, what do you guys think is the biggest difference between the small company and the big company related to EFS, and in your experience?
Do you want to go first on that one?
Sure. I mean, the biggest one is probably resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge difference.
Right.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That resources is a big one. And someone asked the question earlier about enrollment, and some of the things that we're able to do, from a larger company is really, take the time on retraining, refresher training, some marketing tools, those sorts of things that I think may be a little bit more difficult for a smaller company to implement.
Right. So besides what you both presented, are there any other tips on reducing those approval times? Or just those administrative times?
So I definitely think that I did mention this already, but I did want to elaborate on it. The investigator representation during the local IRB meetings has been very helpful. Like I said, it really reduces that time of, having the IRB issue their questions, having to respond. That could really cut down 2-3 weeks from the timeline. So you just, really want to emphasize that if you can encourage your investigators to attend and be prepared to answer any questions, you can really, address all of those questions during the meeting and eliminate, a good 3 weeks from your timeline.
And that's definitely something we have heard from sites and sponsors as a best practice.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've done the same.
And a question for Maureen. What are some challenges that sponsors encounter in getting their EFS ID approved by FDA?
Sure. So certainly I think many sponsors in EFS, particularly for EFS, it can be challenging to strike the right balance between what the non-clinical data needs are and communicating what can be learned from the clinical investigation as well as mediating risk. So certainly early discussions with us can be quite helpful in trying to strike that balance between what non-clinical testing is important to conduct before the EFS starts and what clinical mitigations are going to be the most helpful to address the remaining risks. We certainly found that the informed consent form can be one way to help navigate those challenges. But another tool that sponsors don't often propose, at least initially, is more frequent reporting to us up front. This is particularly, I think, helpful if it's more of a risk around the uncertainty of how the device is going to perform, or uncertainty around how whether some clinical event may occur after use of the device. And by proposing more frequent reporting to us up front and building that into the protocol, it helps us to have better confirmation that we'll get information on any important safety issues that may be occurring up front, and that additional clinical mitigations or corrective forms can take place. And so that is actually a tool that I think sometimes is underused to help navigate some of those situations where there's a lot of uncertainty in the device, how the device will perform, and potential for high risk.
Thank you, Maureen. That's good to know. Well, I think we're getting close to the time. I just wanted to remind everyone that we have resources available at the MDIC website, and you can subscribe to our newsletter where we put out some information at least once a month, and you can download the tools and templates. And if you want to record a copy of this recording or the previous webinar, you can find them in the MDIC webinar website. And finally, I just wanted to thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists for those great presentations, and thank you, everyone, for joining in today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana.
Thank you.